Why American bombers feared Britain's tiny Mosquito plane in August 1943. At RAF Maham, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell watched a de Havilland Mosquito taxi by his B-17 Flying Fortress. The difference between the two planes was striking. His bomber was a huge four-engine Fortress, loaded with machine guns, armored positions for the crew, and self-sealing fuel tanks. In contrast, the British Mosquito was small, sleek, made of wood, and had no defensive weapons at all. Mitchell had come to England 3 months earlier with the 8th Air Force as part of the American bombing campaign against Germany. His squadron flew daylight precision raids deep into enemy territory, often facing fierce fighter attacks and flak that darkened the skies. Every mission was a risky gamble. Would they make it to the target, drop their bombs, and return home before being overwhelmed by German fighters? The losses were high. During a recent raid on Schweinfurt, 60 out of 230 bombers were lost 26% casualties in just one mission. Mitchell had seen bombers explode around him, watched as crews bailed out, and counted the empty spots when his squadron came back to base. And yet, here was this unarmed wooden British plane, flying bombing missions over Germany with minimal losses. A RAF pilot stepped out of the Mosquito, removing his flight helmet. Mitchell, curious, approached him. "Excuse me, Flight Lieutenant. I'm Colonel Mitchell, 8th Air Force. Can I ask you about your aircraft?" The young British pilot, perhaps 25, exuded the casual confidence of someone who had survived many combat missions. "Flight Lieutenant David Reynolds, 105 Squadron." "What would you like to know, Colonel?" Mitchell asked about the Mosquito. "I've heard that you fly to Berlin and back without fighter escorts, no defensive guns, and your losses are low." "That can't be right." Reynolds smiled slightly. "It depends on what you mean by low. We've lost some aircraft, sure, but our loss rate is about 2% per mission." Mitchell, surprised, replied, "We're losing 20% on each mission. But we carry 10 tons of bombs, 10-man crews, and fly in armored planes with fighter escorts." "You carry what? 2 tons? 2 crew members? No armor, no guns, no escort?" "Yes," Reynolds confirmed. 2 crew pilot and navigator. No guns or armor, just speed and altitude. The Mosquito cruises at 380 miles per hour at 28,000 feet. German fighters have trouble catching us, and when they do, we can outrun them. Mitchell looked at the Mosquito again, now intrigued. The aircraft, sleek and simple with a streamlined fuselage and twin engines, looked fragile compared to his B-17. "It's made of wood." "How does it survive combat?" he asked. "Wood has its advantages," Reynolds explained. "It doesn't show up well on radar, it's easy to repair, and it's lightweight, which helps with speed. We fixed battle damage using standard carpentry methods, and the whole plane weighs less than your bomber's bomb load." Mitchell, still skeptical, said, "But you only carry 2 tons of bombs." "We carry 5 times that." Reynolds responded, "True, but we reach the target. Our navigation is more accurate because we don't have to deal with fighter attacks. We bomb from higher altitudes with better precision, and we almost always make it back. Your 10-ton bomb load doesn't help if the aircraft doesn't survive long enough to drop it." Mitchell felt the sting of the implication. The American bombers, heavily armed and armored, were taking huge losses, while the British Mosquitoes, unarmed and lightweight, were consistently completing their missions. Something was clearly wrong with the American approach. The Mosquito's origins were rooted in a radical idea that bombers didn't need defensive armament if they were fast enough to outrun enemy fighters. In 1938, when the British Air Ministry insisted on heavily armed, armored bombers, Geoffrey de Havilland suggested the opposite. His company, known for civilian aircraft and wooden construction, proposed building a bomber entirely out of wood, removing guns and armor and relying on speed for protection. The Air Ministry rejected the idea at first. Aviation experts believed bombers needed guns to survive. However, de Havilland persisted, running the calculations. A wooden airframe would be lighter than metal, and removing guns and armor would save weight, allowing for more engines and fuel. Powered by twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the resulting plane would be faster than any fighter in service and capable of flying at altitudes where fighters couldn't reach. Though still skeptical, the Air Ministry ordered a small number of planes in 1940, mainly because Britain was running low on aluminum. The Mosquito, built using the furniture industry's resources, was an alternative to metal aircraft. The first prototype flew in November 1940, and test pilots were impressed. The aircraft handled beautifully, outrunning even the Spitfire, Britain's fastest fighter, in level flight. Production began in 1941, but doubts remained. Many bomber commanders still refused to use the unarmed aircraft, the Mosquito's first operational missions. The idea of the Mosquito was initially met with skepticism by many, especially those who flew traditional bombers, large, heavily armored planes with defensive armament. They viewed the Mosquito as a dangerous experiment, one that would easily be shot down by German fighters. When the first operational squadrons began flying the Mosquito, they faced resistance from their peers. These crews, however, would prove the doubters wrong. The 105 Squadron received their first operational Mosquitoes in November 1941, and their role was to conduct reconnaissance and precision bombing, where accuracy was more important than the weight of the bombs. The crews were all volunteers, experienced pilots who were eager to fly an aircraft that, according to conventional wisdom, shouldn't survive combat. Flight Lieutenant David Reynolds was one of the first volunteers. He had flown Blenheim bombers earlier in the war and had seen firsthand how vulnerable they were. The Blenheim was fast, but underarmed, suffering terrible losses to German fighters. When Reynolds heard about the Mosquito, he immediately volunteered. The Blenheim tried to be both fast and well-armed, but it failed at both, he later explained. The Mosquito, however, made it clear speed alone was enough for survival. That logic appealed to him. Their first operational mission was a photographic reconnaissance mission over northern France in September 1941. Reynolds and his navigator, Philip Sampson, flew at low altitude across the Channel, climbed to 30,000 feet over France, photographed their targets, and returned without encountering any enemy aircraft. Reynolds recalled that the mission was almost disappointing. We had prepared for a dramatic confrontation with German fighters, practiced evasion tactics, and worked out emergency procedures. But instead, we flew to France, took some pictures, and came home. The Germans never even got close enough to fight. The first bombing missions came in May 1942. These were precision strikes on specific targets, such as buildings, rail junctions, and bridges, where accuracy was far more important than sheer destructive power. The Mosquitoes would fly solo or in pairs, directly to their targets, bomb from high altitudes, and leave before the Germans had a chance to respond. This was a completely different strategy compared to heavy bomber operations. The large American and British bombers flew in massive formations for mutual protection, approaching targets in daylight and battling through enemy fighters. In contrast, the Mosquitoes flew alone, relying on speed, surprise, and precision, and were usually gone before the Germans even realized they had been attacked. The difference in loss rates was striking. In the first 6 months of Mosquito operations, 105 Squadron flew 144 missions and lost only 2 aircraft, a 1.4% loss rate. In comparison, heavy bombers typically had loss rates of 5 to 10% per mission. And in some cases, the losses were even higher on particularly dangerous raids. 1. Of the most famous missions that established that the Mosquito's reputation took place on January 30th, 1943. This date was significant because it marked the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, and the Nazi leadership had planned a large celebration in Berlin with Hermann Göring giving a radio speech. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of RF Bomber Command, decided to disrupt this celebration. He couldn't risk sending heavy bombers to Berlin in daylight. Such a mission would be disastrous. But he could send the Mosquitoes. 3 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron were assigned the mission. The plan was daring: fly to Berlin during the day, bomb the city while Göring was giving his speech, and return before nightfall. The timing was meant to humiliate the Nazis by showing that British aircraft could strike Berlin at will. Reynolds was chosen to lead the mission. He and navigator Sampson meticulously planned the route, which was 600 miles each way over occupied Europe, much of it defended by the Germans. They would fly at maximum altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire, rely on speed to escape enemy fighters, and hit Berlin exactly when Göring's speech began. The mission took off from RAF Marham at 11:15 a.m. The 3 Mosquitoes climbed to 28,000 feet and headed east. German radar picked them up as they crossed the Dutch coast, but the planes were too high and fast for the anti-aircraft batteries to target. German fighter controllers sent Messerschmitt Bf-109s to intercept, but the fighters couldn't climb fast enough to reach the Mosquitoes before the British planes passed them. Reynolds' navigation was perfect. The Mosquitoes reached Berlin at precisely 4 p.m., right as Göring began his speech. They dropped bombs over the city center, targeting the area around the radio station where the speech was being broadcast. The bombs didn't hit the radio station itself, but they were close enough. The explosions were loud enough to be heard during the live broadcast. Göring stopped speaking mid-sentence, and air raid sirens could be heard in the background. The celebration was ruined. The German public, who had been told that British planes couldn't reach Berlin in daylight, now heard bombs exploding live on the radio. The 3 Mosquitoes turned and flew back west. German fighters pursued, but couldn't catch them. Anti-aircraft guns fired as the planes crossed back over the coast, but the Mosquitoes used their speed and altitude to evade them. All 3 planes returned to RAF Marham without damage. The mission had taken 6 hours, covered 1,200 miles, bombed Berlin during a major Nazi event, and cost only fuel and bombs. The propaganda impact was massive. German civilians, who had been told that British aircraft couldn't strike Berlin in daylight, now knew otherwise. The Mosquito's success and American skepticism during the Nazi leadership's speech. The Mosquitoes' raid embarrassed them, showing that the RAF could strike anywhere in Germany when conditions were favorable. The mission proved that speed and altitude could replace heavy armament. The Americans began to take notice. Despite the success of the Mosquito, American bomber commanders remained firmly committed to their strategy. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were exceptional bombers, capable of carrying 5 tons of bombs and equipped with 13.50 caliber machine guns for defense. The American doctrine held that these bombers, flying in tight formations for mutual defense, could enter German airspace without fighter escorts and still complete their bombing missions. The reality, however, was far grimmer. German fighters had learned to attack bombers head-on, where the defensive guns were weakest, overwhelming them with multiple attackers. After the disastrous Schweinfurt raid in August 1943, where 60 bombers were lost in a single mission, American commanders faced tough questions. Should they suspend daylight bombing until long-range fighter escorts were available? Should they rethink their tactics or even consider using different aircraft? Some American officers began to look at the Mosquito with new interest. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, for example, was among them. After his conversation with Reynolds at RAF Marham, Mitchell requested to fly in a Mosquito himself to better understand its capabilities. Reynolds arranged the flight, and Mitchell flew as an observer on a training mission. He was impressed by the aircraft's performance. It was faster than his B-17 could fly at full speed and could climb easily to 30,000 feet, while the B-17 struggled to reach 25,000 feet. The handling was responsive, the visibility was great, and flying it felt completely different from operating heavy bombers. "It's like comparing a race car to a truck," Mitchell said after landing. "The B-17 is powerful, tough, and can take a lot of damage, but it's slow, clumsy, and vulnerable. This aircraft is fast, nimble, and can avoid damage altogether. I understand now why your losses are so low." However, Mitchell also realized why the Mosquito wasn't ideal for the American strategic bombing approach. "You're carrying 2 tons of bombs. We need to deliver 10 tons per aircraft to make our raids worthwhile. Even if we had Mosquitoes, we'd need 5 times as many to deliver the same amount of bombs. The logistics just aren't possible." Reynolds agreed, acknowledging the differences in their doctrines. "We're not trying to destroy entire industrial areas," he explained. "We focus on precision targets where a few well-placed bombs are more valuable than hundreds of tons of scattered explosives. For that kind of mission, the Mosquito is perfect. But for your missions," he gestured at the B-17, "you need your bombers." The conversation, however, planted seeds of doubt. Was the American approach the best way forward? Were there situations where speed and precision might be more important than sheer tonnage and firepower? Could other objectives be achieved more efficiently with different aircraft? The Yemen's prison raid on February 18, 1944, showed the Mosquito's capabilities in a mission that would have been impossible for any other aircraft. The target was a prison in northern France, where the Gestapo was holding 120 French resistance members who were about to be executed. British intelligence had received a desperate request: destroy the prison walls to allow the prisoners to escape. The mission required extreme precision, as the prison was located in a populated area. The walls needed to be breached without harming the prisoners inside. A typical heavy bomber raid would have flattened the entire facility, causing unacceptable collateral damage. What was needed was a surgical strike, with bombs placed precisely on the prison walls. The Mosquitoes of 140 Wing were assigned the task. 19 aircraft took part in the mission, flying at extremely low altitudes, no higher than 100 feet, to achieve the precision required. The crews studied reconnaissance photos, memorized the prison layout, and planned their routes to minimize exposure to German defenses. The formation took off from RAF Huntston at 11 a.m., flying at wave-top height to avoid German radar detection. They navigated by visual landmarks, and their approach was timed to reach the prison during lunch hour, when most of the guards would be in the canteen. The first wave of 3 Mosquitoes attacked at 12:30 p.m., releasing bombs with such precision that they struck the base of the outer prison wall exactly as planned. The explosions created holes large enough for men to escape through. The second wave attacked the guard quarters, neutralizing them and preventing a coordinated response. The third wave targeted the inner prison buildings, causing further confusion. The entire raid lasted just 4 minutes. The Mosquitoes flew low to avoid German fighters, who could not respond in time. 2 aircraft were lost, one to ground fire, and another that flew too low and struck a prison building's chimney. However, 17 planes returned safely. The results exceeded expectations. The prison walls were breached, allowing 258 prisoners to escape, 182 of whom evaded recapture. Among the escapees were many resistance members scheduled for execution. The precision of the attack meant minimal casualties among the prisoners, only 50 died. The Mosquito's role in the air war during the raid. Most of the casualties were caused by bombs that struck the prison buildings. The mission demonstrated capabilities that no other aircraft had. Heavy bombers couldn't achieve the precision needed, and fighter bombers lacked the range and bomb load. Only the Mosquito had the speed, range, precision, and sufficient payload to carry out the mission successfully. American bomber commanders studied the raid closely. The B-17 and B-24 were powerful bombers for strategic bombing, but they couldn't perform precision strikes like the Mosquito. The Mosquito had found a niche in the air war that heavy bombers couldn't fulfill. Pathfinder role by mid-1944. Mosquitoes had taken on another important role, guiding heavy bomber raids. The aircraft's speed and altitude allowed it to reach targets ahead of the main bomber formations, mark them with flares or target indicators, and then guide the heavy bombers to accurate bombing points. The Pathfinder squadrons were elite units, tasked with the most dangerous missions and requiring the highest accuracy. They would arrive at the target first, identify precise aiming points despite weather or darkness, mark them clearly, and often stay in the area during the raid to assess results and guide the following waves of bombers. Squadron leader Robert Braithwaite flew Pathfinder Mosquitoes from early 1944 until the end of the war. His role was to guide American heavy bomber raids to German targets, marking the aiming points for B-17s and B-24s to bomb during daylight. We would arrive 20 minutes before the American formations, Braithwaite explained. We'd identify the target, whether it was a factory or a rail yard, and mark it with colored smoke or target indicators. The American bombers would then aim at our markers, achieving accuracy that would be impossible if they were flying blind. The cooperation between the Mosquitoes and American bombers was a symbiotic relationship. The Mosquitoes provided the precision targeting that the Americans needed, and the American bombers provided the destructive power that the Mosquitoes lacked. Together, they accomplished things neither could achieve alone. Mitchell, who flew several missions with Mosquito Pathfinders marking his targets, saw the dramatic improvement in accuracy. I stopped thinking of the Mosquito as an alternative to our bombers, Mitchell later wrote. It was a complementary system, different capabilities for different missions. We needed both, the heavy bombers for tonnage and destructive power, and the Mosquitoes for speed, precision, and specialized tasks. Together, we could achieve objectives that neither could accomplish independently. The speed problem, despite growing appreciation for the Mosquito's capabilities, American bomber crews remained cautious about the aircraft. The reason was simple and primal. The Mosquito was faster than American fighters. When Mosquitoes and American bombers operated in the same airspace, the British aircraft were sometimes mistaken for enemy planes by American gunners. The Mosquito's silhouette was unfamiliar, and its speed made it seem threatening. Nervous gunners sometimes fired before properly identifying targets. Several incidents occurred where American bombers opened fire on Mosquitoes. In March 1944. A Mosquito flying a Pathfinder mission ahead of an American bomber stream was engaged by nervous B-17 gunners, who saw the fast, twin-engine aircraft approaching and assumed it was German. The Mosquito managed to evade without damage, but the incident highlighted the risk. Flight Lieutenant Reynolds experienced a similar situation in April 1944, while marking targets for an American raid. His Mosquito was fired upon by a B-24 formation. We were at 28,000 feet, clearly marked with British insignia, flying straight and level to mark the target, Reynolds recalled. Suddenly, tracers flew past our wing. A B-24 gunner had decided we looked suspicious and opened fire. I took evasive action, rolling the Mosquito into a diving turn that no German aircraft could match, and radioed to the American formation, "Bloody hell, we're on your side. Stop shooting at the Pathfinders." The firing stopped, but the incident showed how the Mosquito's speed and appearance could confuse even friendly forces. Coordination. Procedures were soon established. Mosquitoes would announce their presence to American formations, describe their positions, and stay clear of bomber streams unless actively marking targets. American gunners also received additional training to help them recognize the Mosquito. However, the underlying issue remained. The Mosquito's speed made it difficult for American crews to differentiate it from enemy aircraft. "We feared German fighters for good reason," Mitchell reflected. "They were killing us daily. But we also feared the Mosquito, not because it was dangerous, but because it was so different from our doctrine that we didn't know how to work with it. That fear was our failure, not the aircraft's." The final year being 1945, the Mosquito had become indispensable to Allied air operations. The aircraft flew more mission types than any other wartime plane, including high-altitude bombing, low-level precision strikes, pathfinding, night fighting, photographic reconnaissance, submarine hunting, and even civilian transport. Its versatility made it a vital asset to the Allies, capable of performing a wide range of missions that other aircraft simply couldn't handle. The Mosquito's effectiveness and American bomber doctrine. The Mosquito's design was simple yet effective, fast, long-ranged, and capable of carrying various equipment depending on its role. Throughout the war, its loss rates remained surprisingly low, averaging only 2 to 3% per mission, far lower than the loss rates of heavy bombers. Some specialized units flying particularly risky missions did experience higher losses, but even then, the losses rarely exceeded 5%. In contrast, American heavy bombers typically had loss rates of 5 to 7% per mission during 1943 to 1944, with some raids experiencing losses over 20%. The difference was stark. A Mosquito crew could expect to survive an entire operational tour, while heavy bomber crews faced grim odds, with many not even completing 25 missions. This survival rate built confidence and encouraged aggressive tactics. Mosquito crews knew they had a high chance of survival, which motivated them to volunteer for repeated missions. In contrast, heavy bomber crews understood their odds were poor, making them more cautious and resistant to extending tours. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell completed his combat tour in early 1945, having flown 35 missions over Germany. Of the 10 aircraft in his original squadron, 7 had been shot down, and 63 men who arrived with him were either dead or captured. He attended a celebration at RAF Marham for 105. Squadron's completion of 500 operational sorties. The atmosphere was light and almost cheerful, a stark contrast to the somber mood in American heavy bomber squadrons, where every mission was simply survived, not celebrated. Reynolds, now a squadron leader with 2 tours completed and starting his 3rd, was still flying. Mitchell asked how he maintained his nerve after so many missions. "It's not nerve, Colonel, it's mathematics," Reynolds replied. "Each mission has about a 2% chance of loss. After 200 sorties, I've beaten the odds, but the odds themselves are manageable. Your bombers face 5 to 10% loss rates. After 10 missions, you've lost half your original squadron. That's not survivable math. That's attrition warfare." Mitchell couldn't argue with the numbers. "I envy you that wooden plane. It's kept you alive when metal and guns couldn't save us." Reynolds nodded. "Different doctrines, different aircraft, different results. We chose speed over protection. You chose protection over speed. History will judge which was correct." Post-war recognition of the Mosquito's wartime performance was extraordinary by any measure. Nearly 8,000 aircraft were built, flying over 200,000 operational sorties. Its loss rates were among the lowest of any combat aircraft, and its versatility allowed it to serve in nearly every role except heavy strategic bombing. Despite this, the Mosquito received less recognition than other wartime planes. The Spitfire became Britain's most famous fighter. The Lancaster bomber was celebrated for the Dambusters raid, and American bombers were immortalized in films and memorials. The Mosquito, however, remained relatively obscure despite its superior performance and lower casualties. Part of this was due to the nature of the aircraft itself. The Mosquito didn't participate in dramatic battles or destroy iconic targets like the Dams or Berlin in massive raids. It simply flew its missions efficiently, completed its objectives, and returned home. Efficiency doesn't create legends the way dramatic sacrifice does. American bomber crews who had watched the Mosquito operate with envy recognized its superiority for certain missions. Mitchell later wrote in his memoir, "We flew our heavy bombers with courage born of necessity. We accepted terrible losses because we believed in the importance of strategic bombing. But I always envied the Mosquito crews. Their aircraft were fast enough to avoid most dangers, versatile enough to execute any mission, and survivable enough that most crews completed their tours alive." Geoffrey de Havilland. The Mosquito's designer received a knighthood after the war but remained modest about his creation. "We designed an efficient aircraft using available materials and sound aerodynamics," he said. The Mosquito's success came from refusing to accept conventional wisdom about bomber design. Sometimes the best protection is simply not to be hit at all. Lessons from the Mosquito taught lessons that military planners took years to fully accept. Speed and altitude could provide better protection than armor and guns. Smaller, more efficient aircraft could achieve strategic results comparable to larger bombers. Versatility was often more valuable than specialization. Simple materials like wood could outperform advanced metals in certain situations. Eventually, American air doctrine incorporated some of these lessons. Post-war bombers like the B-52, designed in the late 1940s, carried minimal defensive guns compared to wartime bombers, relying instead on altitude, speed, and electronic countermeasures for survival. But the core lesson remained difficult to accept. Sometimes the unconventional approach succeeds, where traditional wisdom fails. The Mosquito worked because it violated every assumption about bomber design. It succeeded because it rejected the protection that everyone believed was necessary. The American bombers that feared the Mosquito feared its speed, its difference, and the challenge it posed to their doctrine. Accepting that an unarmed wooden plane could outperform armored metal fortresses required admitting that the entire heavy bomber program might have been flawed. That admission came slowly and grudgingly, after thousands of bomber crewmen had died flying aircraft designed to prioritize protection over speed. The mathematics were clear. Mosquito crews survived while heavy bomber crews died. But doctrinal inertia and institutional pride prevented a quick adaptation. Epilogue. The last Mosquito, the final operational Mosquito, was retired from RAF service in 1963. Nearly 20 years after the war ended, the aircraft continued flying reconnaissance, target towing, and specialized missions where its speed and range remained invaluable. Today, fewer than 30 Mosquitoes survive worldwide, most of them in museums. The wooden construction that made the Mosquito so practical during wartime proved its vulnerability in peacetime. Wood rots, fabric deteriorates, and maintenance becomes impossible. Most of the 8,000 Mosquitoes built have disappeared completely. However, aviation enthusiasts remember the wooden wonder that proved speed could replace armor. They remember the aircraft that flew to Berlin and back when heavy bombers were being slaughtered over France. They remember the aircraft that allowed crews to survive in situations where survival seemed impossible. Flight Lieutenant David Reynolds flew his final Mosquito mission in June 1945, a reconnaissance sortie over Germany documenting war damage. By then, he had completed 3 operational tours, flown 187 combat missions, and survived the war without serious injury, something that would have been virtually impossible in a heavy bomber. When asked in a post-war interview whether he would have volunteered for the Mosquitoes if he'd known the risks beforehand, his answer was immediate. The question is backwards. If I'd known the survival rates, I'd have volunteered even more eagerly. The Mosquito kept me alive through 3 years of combat. That wooden plane was the safest aircraft in the war for one simple reason: it was too fast to catch. American bomber crews eventually stopped fearing the Mosquito and started envying it. They recognized what the small wooden plane represented: an approach to aerial warfare that prioritized survival through performance, rather than accepting losses through inadequate speed. The Mosquito didn't revolutionize strategic bombing, but it demonstrated that speed, altitude, and precision could achieve results that tonnage and defensive armor could not. The lesson, painfully learned over years of brutal combat, remains relevant to military aviation today. The tiny wooden plane that American bombers once feared became the aircraft they wished they had flown.